Recently, on some of the biggest podcasts in the world, people have been discussing the resurrection of Jesus. Comedian Chris DiStefano, who grew up Catholic, went on to Bill Maher recently to talk about Jesus.
I believe in Jesus, by the way. We'll talk about that.
Bill Maher was characteristically unimpressed.
Believe in whatever you want.
Chris then went on to Joe Rogan to speak about the resurrection.
A big thing is the resurrection, right? People say, really?
Alex O'Connor, famously skeptical about Christian claims, went on to Chris Williamson's podcast, and he too spoke about the resurrection of Jesus.
There's a bunch of historical facts surrounding Jesus' alleged resurrection.
Both of them laid out what's come to be known as a minimal facts argument for the resurrection of Jesus. They laid out certain facts that most people can already agree to. Things like Jesus was definitely crucified by the Romans.
Everybody agreed he died. That's 100%.
This man gets crucified by the Romans.
On the third day, the tomb was empty and people saw Jesus.
3 days later, the tomb's empty, and they say 500 people saw him in the town.
Paul refers to Jesus having appeared to 500 people at once.
Having laid out those minimal facts, you then try to explain them. And one explanation is maybe the disciples stole the body and then lied about it.
The other conspiracy theory is like, well, the disciples robbed his body.
Maybe they're lying, but then you don't tend to go to death for something you know to be a lie.
Or maybe they didn't lie about it, they were fooled about it, and they hallucinated the whole thing.
Maybe they were mistaken. You don't get group hallucinations like that.
But if the disciples didn't lie to themselves and they weren't lying to you, then I guess they're telling the truth and you can believe the resurrection. That's how the minimal facts argument goes. Joe Rogan, though, was not persuaded.
Is the most logical explanation that a dead guy came back to life?
Alex O'Connor was not persuaded either.
It's an interesting argument and it's quite powerful, however...
However, what? Well, we're going to see what Alex O'Connor finds lacking in the minimal facts argument, and I think Alex is right on that point. This video is about showing you what's helpful and what's unhelpful about the minimal facts argument. Hi, I'm Glen from Speak Life. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. On Joe Rogan recently, Chris DiStefano he's just read Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ, and he's very excited about laying out this case before Joe Rogan. Let's see how Chris does, and let's see how Joe reacts.
A big thing is the resurrection, right? People say, really? He resurrected from the dead? Mm-hmm. And you're like, well, everybody agreed, haters, Romans, and the Jewish people, everybody agreed he died. That's 100%. That's why when they stab him and you say water came out, it wasn't water, it was fluid from his lungs because he was dead. And that's what would happen.
From around his heart, yep.
We have this lung fluid that comes out. So that's what they said, oh, that's water. And that's what they made him divinity. But it was like a natural thing. He's dead. Everyone agrees. And you say, well, they buried him in a tomb. And then the next day, or 3 days later, the tomb's empty. And people are like, so, you know, that made up. And they say 500 people saw him in the town. Romans and Hebrew, they saw him over the next couple of weeks. 500 independently sourced people, real, like corroborated, 500 people saw him. Mm-hmm. So you say, okay, so there's that. And then the other conspiracy theory is like, well, the disciples robbed his body. The disciples just robbed his body.
So at this point, Chris has moved on from the facts that we can agree to, and he's moved on to the interpretation of those facts. What are the theories for why Christians came up with the story of the resurrection of Jesus? And so having laid out the facts, yep, he was definitely killed. He was definitely laid in that tomb. They knew where the tomb was. 3 days later, that tomb was empty. The body was never discovered. And there are resurrection appearances that happen, sometimes hundreds of people at once. And those resurrection appearances went on for about 40 days until Christians say Jesus returned back to heaven. So those are the facts. What are the interpretations? Well, maybe the disciples robbed the body, right? And then made up the story. But he goes on to talk about how plausible that interpretation is. That's
probably not what happened. And the Romans themselves acknowledge there's no body in that tomb that we put in there 3 days ago.
Okay, so that's the important thing. Both the Romans and the Jewish authorities had every incentive in the world to find that body, produce that body, especially once Peter starts preaching and thousands start believing in the Jesus movement. At that point, the authorities have every incentive to find that body and nip this nascent movement in the bud. But they never did, and no body was ever found. So, he's doing a good job here.
The body is not there, and we did it. So in order to save ourselves, we're going to say the apostles robbed it. But in reality, that's just a conspiracy because the apostles would have no reason to rob it.
Yeah, Matthew 27 records that the next day, we're talking about the Saturday, the chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. So the Jewish authorities went to the Roman authority in the town and said, "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, the deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day, otherwise his disciples may come and steal the body and tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first." And then you go to Matthew 28, from verse 12, "When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, 'You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were still asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day."
So the Romans think the apostles robbed the body.
That's a conspiracy.
Why do you say conspiracy?
Well,
You're saying a conspiracy to diminish the story.
No. I meant conspiracy in the sense of that's what people say as a reason why the
Did the Romans say that?
The Romans have said that. The
Yeah.
Romans said that back then, and then I guess
Right.
conspiracy is the wrong word because I'm not like it's one story, one
It's an
explanation.
alternative explanation.
Explanation of.
But if you looked at it like what's the most logical explanation? Is the most logical explanation that a dead guy came back to life? Or the most logical explanation that someone took his body, because that's what the Romans said?
So Joe's bringing his skepticism to bear. I did chuckle when I saw the first comment on this video. The first commenter says, "Rogan, aliens and space and DMT elves." Also Rogan. But if you thought about it logically, it's kind of pointing to the fact that we all have our plausibility structures and we all set the bar at certain levels depending on whether we want something to be true or not. And if you want something to be true, you set the bar very low for evidence. And if you do not want something to be true, you set the bar very high for evidence. But he's making the decent point. Well, why not believe the Romans and their account of the story and the chief priests? Why not believe that version of the disciples stole the body, rather than Jesus rose again? Let's see what Chris makes of that.
I'm saying that
You think he came back to life?
one time, and I'm not saying I'm crazy about it. I'm just saying, you know what? After reading that book, there was enough things that happened that historical scholars who aren't religious, some are believers, some are not,
Right.
are
you're-
like, this
but
existed
hold
and
on.
this happened.
But you're talking about historical scholars from 2,000 years ago.
No, he's not. He's talking about historical scholars who are looking at the evidence from 2,000 years ago, but he's looking at the scholarship from today that is doing its very best to get at the very earliest historical evidence from 2,000 years ago.
Right.
And their knowledge of science and biology and life.
Their knowledge of life and biology 2,000 years ago was not as sophisticated as ours. That is absolutely true, but they still know that dead men stay dead, right? And in fact, I mean, the Christian position is precisely that. Dead men stay dead. This is a miracle. Like, the Christian position is not, Jesus rose from the dead. I guess that's the kind of thing that can happen. Maybe it happens all the time. Like actually the Christian position is that this is an extraordinary event marking out Jesus as the Son of God with divine power. And therefore, its remarkability shows you that what ordinarily happens is that dead men stay dead. So even a miraculous belief in the supernatural relies not on dead people getting up from the dead as a regular occurrence. It relies on the regularity of dead people staying dead. And everybody knew that. Even those with a very supernatural belief really believed that dead men stayed dead. And the remarkable thing about the resurrection is that there was this one guy. And we're not saying it's a regular occurrence. We're saying it is an interruption of the corruption that happens to humanity, because this guy is different. We're not saying that ancient people thought that death was different. We're saying that this person from ancient history was different. And what we'll see is it's your view of Jesus himself that'll make all the difference to how you assess history.
The universe itself was extremely limited.
Right.
And so their entire fundamentals, like everything they believed in, was based on mythology. Everything was based on gods and demons.
Well, that's true. Ancient people, the Romans believed in gods, and the Jewish people believed in the God who is really there. And, they believed in spirits and angels and demons, and they had an enchanted view of life. That's true. But they also had a very prosaic view of life. The Romans knew how to build an empire, the greatest empire that the world had ever seen up until that point. The Jews knew how to build a city, Jerusalem, this, city on a hill that cannot be hidden, that was the envy of so many. They knew how life worked, they knew how death worked, and they knew that dead people stayed dead. Yes, they had an enchanted view of the world, but here's the thing. Is that a limited understanding of the world? To have an enchanted view of the world, is that a limited understanding? Or mightn't you say that it's a limited view of the world to think that the world grinds along according to iron laws of physics and chemistry, right? If you think that all of reality is boiled down to chemistry and physics, and you can get down to subatomic particles, and we're just quarks and leptons fizzing, and that's reality. If matter in motion is all there is or was or ever shall be, and that's your view of the world, why don't we think of that as the limited view, right? You've got to figure out what's actually out there in the world before you start calling worldviews limited. And if somebody has a view of the world that includes the God who made it and includes spiritual reality, you've got to be very sure that the universe is just matter in motion to say that that's a limited view. Because the religious worldview, which is by far the majority view of people around the world and down through history, that would look at Western modern materialism as the limited view. And at that point, you've got to figure out, well, what kind of universe do we live in? Do we live in a universe that is thrumming with the glory of God, right? That has a spiritual basis to it? Or do we think that the universe is matter in motion? Like, what do we think? And one way you can have a look at the subject is, with an open mind, try and see whether God might have shown up on planet Earth, whether he might have done the sorts of things that you would expect God to do, like walk on water and heal the sick and raise the dead and feed people and answer every question that's ever asked to him and explain the meaning of life and give himself in utter, love and sacrifice for the world, and walk out of that tomb 3 days later showing people the nail marks in his hand. And people say, "My Lord and my God," and he births the greatest movement that the world has ever seen. Right? That's the sort of thing you might expect if God is in fact real and if he's shown up in love in the way that Christians have always said that he is. And to set all that aside, maybe that is the limited view. I put it to you.
All right, fine. What if the Romans, they made it up, right? The Romans are correct. The disciples took the body, who everyone agreed was dead. What about the 500 people that saw him in the town over the next 6 weeks?
Okay, so that's good. Okay, so maybe the body has been stolen, Jesus is absolutely dead, and people, hundreds of people at a time, as 1 Corinthians 15 records, how do you explain that?
Did you talk to those people?
No.
So who knows what they believed, but who knows what they actually believed? Who knows how they said it? Who knows if it was a religious thing? You look, there's people that have mass hallucinations all the time about a lot of things, and there's people that you could give them false memory. False memory is a real thing. Someone can convince you that something happened that didn't happen.
Right.
It's real. It's like they've demonstrated how to do it. We all know friends that have a memory of something, and you go, "That's not what happened," and then you say your version of it, and then everybody has to figure out what really happened.
Right.
You're like, "Do you remember that time we were at the game and you said this?" I didn't say that. That was not me.
Yeah.
That was Mike.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're like, "What? Yeah. You remember Mike lost his job?
Right.
And he was drunk. Do you remember?" And you're like, "Oh yeah." You thought it was me. You put it on me. It's like, you change things. People change things.
Right.
People change things. That's absolutely true. He talks about mass hallucinations. I haven't done a lot of study into that. Maybe there are mass hallucinations, but they don't tend to be our explanation for other events that are testified to by eyewitnesses. And especially when it gets to the level of 500 people. You don't tend to, I can't think of another example where you would say, I think those 500 people had a mass hallucination. You certainly might say that certain people have had religious experiences and will swear blind that X or Y happened. But if you're going to go down the minimal historical facts route, you're going to take this together in the sweep of all the historical data. You're going to start talking about Jesus and his teaching. You're going to start talking about why the disciples stuck to their story, even though it cost them their lives. People lie to get out of trouble. They don't lie to get into trouble. And the disciples absolutely, if the Romans story is true, then the disciples lied to get into trouble. And you start to get into that kind of thing. But I mean, Joe's not making terrible points. He's making good points here, right? But what Joe Rogan does, everyone's going to do. I'm going to do. If somebody, brings me these alternative explanations and says, that could not happen, that could not happen, that could not happen, therefore it has to be this. Everyone has been trained to look to poke holes in those kinds of arguments. And Joe Rogan is doing that, and fair play to him.
They also, your memory becomes a memory of your memory and not the actual memory itself.
True.
It becomes a memory of the story you're telling.
Right.
And so if this person was this significant religious guru figure like Jesus was, right? And he really does have this amazing view of how humanity can live in harmony. And he really does talk to people about this. And he really does preach forgiveness. And he really does to treat everybody like they're the same, paupers and hookers and everyone. Everyone's just God's children, loved. When that guy's gone, you're going to miss him, man. You're going to miss him bad. And if you really do have a fundamental view of reality that's based entirely on myth, and you have connected this guy to the Son of Christ, or the Son of God, rather, this figure that is brought here to save us, and the Romans took him from us and killed him, and now he died for our sins, and the whole thing.
Right.
If you have that in your head, and then someone says, I saw him, I saw him too.
Right.
Like, people see the Virgin Mary in a grilled cheese sandwich. People see things.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean those things aren't there.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that isn't a vision, but it also
Yeah.
does mean that people see things that aren't. And there's a lot of people that are not that bright.
Yeah.
They're not smart, and they're easily led, and they're easily manipulated. It also doesn't mean that Jesus wasn't real.
Right.
Like all those things.
Okay.
But it's just the likelihood of someone coming back to life is very low.
Right.
The likelihood of someone taking his body is very high.
Right.
So if you used like Occam's razor, the simplest solution, the simplest answer is probably what you're searching for. It's probably that someone took the body.
Mm-hmm. That's fascinating from Joe, and I think we get a really clear picture of where he's coming from. He seems to have a great love for Jesus and his teaching and forgiveness, and the fact that you can get your sins forgiven, that he's died for the world, and there's an equality of all people and a community that we're encouraged into, and that Jesus accomplished all of that kind of stuff. But then he says that's a reason to think that because he's gone, we're going to miss him. Therefore, we're going to come up with, and it doesn't even have to be nefarious. It could be from the best of intentions that Jesus is gone, and we don't want the Jesus thing to be dead. So we say that he came back to life, and on it kind of goes. Now, a couple of things to say about that, and one is that Joe would not have heard any of that about Jesus Christ unless something absolutely extraordinary happened on the third day, right? All that wonderful teaching that Joe has talked about, that wonderful teaching that has founded civilizations, that has built the world that you live in right now, that would be forgotten within weeks if Jesus rotted in that tomb. That's my position. That something extraordinary happened in order to resurrect Christianity, because the Christianity that Joe is talking about there, about forgiveness and we're all one in Christ and he died for us, and Christianity was dead and buried on that Good Friday. But Christianity is alive and well, and billions of people follow it today, which is an extraordinary miracle. I don't know if Joe believes in the water into wine miracle. Probably he doesn't believe in the water into wine miracle. But to turn God-forsaken execution into world domination, that is orders of magnitude more impressive than turning water into wine. And somehow Christianity has pulled it off. Christianity was dead and buried. Christianity rose again. That is a historical fact. What is it? What is the spiritual impetus? Is it simply a mass hallucination? Lots of people have had religious experiences. Some people have had very powerful religious experiences, but it hasn't built the modern world. right? Lots of great teachers have died and cut off, and nobody said, oh, Socrates must have risen from the dead, right? There were plenty of messiahs, especially around that time, around the year dot. There were plenty of messiahs because there was plenty of messianic expectation, because that's what the scriptures were communicating to people. But I don't know the names of these other people who were crucified in the first century. Right? There are hundreds of them. I don't know the names of these other people. I just know this Jesus, and Joe just knows this Jesus. And as Fleming Rutledge says, the best argument for the resurrection of Jesus is that you've heard of him. Right? Why should you have heard of this guy executed in his early 30s, right? Choking to death as a blasphemer, as an enemy of the state according to Rome, as a blasphemer according to the Jews. And yet, he's the most famous man who's ever lived, and he's built our world, and he did bring this incredible teaching. Christianity has risen from the dead. And at that point, I find the foundation for Christianity being merely a hallucination, merely a religious experience, to be the explanation that is lacking and that is limited, right? But Joe is absolutely right to focus on the person of Jesus, because if the person of Jesus has come and he has brought this wonderful teaching that seems true and true on a profound level, if he's brought this teaching about kind of morality that's true, he's also brought a teaching that, as Joe says, he's the Son of God. And therefore, there is a connection between heaven and earth. Therefore, there is a spiritual reality that has been earthed into our nature in Jesus. And therefore, you ought to expect that surrounding Jesus, extraordinary, transcendent types of things might happen. And that is what raises the probability of Jesus rising from the dead, if we want to do this analysis, right? We shouldn't analyze the probability of any old guy rising from the dead, because that's not the Christian claim. The Christian claim is that he is our creator and that death could not hold him. As Peter says a few weeks later in the book of Acts, he says it was impossible for death to hold him because he's the author of life. Well, of course, if he's the author of life, it would be extraordinary if he rotted in that Jerusalem tomb. That would be the extraordinary thing, right? It all comes down to who Jesus is. And that's where I want to get to with this whole minimal historical facts thing. It doesn't consider the most germane fact of them all. It's treating Jesus as though he is just one more member of the human race, who, of course, if he's just one more member of the human race, he's going to perish. He's going to go the way of all flesh. But the whole thing about Jesus is that he's more than a man, right? That's the whole thing. And that's the whole thing that Joe is describing here. And I was fascinated to see how Alex O'Connor talks about the minimal facts argument for the resurrection. He was on Chris Williamson's podcast recently, and they started talking about the cosmic fine-tuning of the universe. We seem to be in this Goldilocks range, and if the fundamentals of physics were a little bit too great, we wouldn't have a life-sustaining universe, and if they were a little bit less, then we wouldn't have a life-sustaining universe. And that Goldilocks range is so very small. And Alex does a good job of talking about that fine-tuning, and then they get onto the argument for Jesus. And what about the resurrection? And I think it's fascinating what he says. I haven't thought about it in the way that Alex lays it out, and I think he's right.
It is a fascinating mystery. Like, something very strange happened on Easter morning. Because how do we explain the fact that this man gets crucified by the Romans, and then people claim to see him after he died, and were willing to be put to death for that belief? Now, okay, maybe he didn't die. Unlikely. As they say, the Romans knew how to kill people. And supposedly, they check. Likelihood is that he was actually crucified. And then a few days later, people are claiming to see him. Maybe they're lying, but then you don't tend to go to death for something you know to be a lie. You're willing to be put to death for things that you think are true, that are false, but very rarely are people willing to die for beliefs that they don't actually believe themselves. That doesn't really happen. So they probably weren't lying. As maybe they were mistaken.
Fooled.
Yeah. Now, I've known you since about 2019, which is probably, it will have been slightly longer than Jesus was with his disciples, but imagine spending every single day with this person, living with this person, eating with this person, and then you've only seen him a few days ago. And somehow, imagine somebody managed to convince you that they were me. Even if I had a twin brother, they probably wouldn't be able to convince you that it was me. Or maybe they were hallucinating in groups. One of the earliest gospel New Testament sources is the letters of Paul, the earliest. And in one of those letters, Paul refers to Jesus having appeared to 500 people at once. And in some of the Gospels, you get at least some group appearances, at least more than one person, and sometimes, groups of the 12 all seeing Jesus all at once. You don't get group hallucinations like that. And so it doesn't seem like they were mistaken either. And
so he's setting up the whole thing. Like, he's setting up perfectly the way that Gary Habermas would set it up. And he's going through the alternative explanations, and they all seem implausible. And so you're left with, the only thing that's left is that Jesus has risen from the dead.
So if they're not mistaken, they're not making it up. What explains the fact that these people claim to see him after he had died? And the Christian apologists will say that the only real plausible explanation is that he really did rise from the dead. Now, it's an interesting argument, and it's quite powerful. However, my response has always been that this sort of process of elimination is very clever, and that's how it's usually run, but it can go the other way. I mean, imagine I were trying to prove that there was such thing as a group hallucination. I know it's extraordinary, but there was a group hallucination, and I tried to prove it by saying, well, what are the other explanations? Or maybe they lied. Well, they wouldn't do that because they wouldn't go to death. Or maybe a man rose from the dead, but come on, that doesn't happen. That breaks all the laws of physics.
It's brilliant the way he does it, yeah. So it's about the order that you put it in. So if you start with, well, maybe Jesus rose from the dead. Oh, but we know that people don't die. People don't rise from the dead. Or maybe they stole the body and then lied about it, but people don't tend to do it. Or, and then you get to, so I guess with all the other options out of the way, I guess it has to be a group hallucination. Do you see? It's actually about the order of things. When you set it up in just that way, I think Alex is absolutely right. It's about the order in which you consider things. I think Alex is right about that.
Kind of depends where you start. But it is weird. Something very strange seems to have happened on that morning.
Wow. So something very strange seems to have happened. Christianity rose again from the dead. We cannot deny that. And that is an extraordinary thing. Some kind of power was injected into world history 3 days after Jesus was crucified on that cross. Like, genuinely, something did happen. And we know about the Big Bang because there was an expanding universe, and physicists looked up into the sky and they saw the red shift of the light that was moving away from us. Oh, I guess the universe is expanding all around us. Well, if that has been going on for any length of time, well, I guess there must have been a singularity. There must have been a point where we came from. There must have been a bang. And you can do the same thing historically. You can look back to the explosion of the Jesus movement, and it is the most disruptive and the most enduring and the most influential revolution in human history. And it all came from this crucified guy in his early 30s without a penny to his name. Didn't even have an army, let alone a family, let alone a kid. He has no political power. He has no military power. He never writes a book. He never founds a school. And he's the most famous man who ever lived. Something out of seemingly nothing has come everything. What's the bang? What's the spiritual power? And Alex is absolutely right to say, well, something really strange happened. But it's how you set up the story, and it's who you say Jesus is. Did you notice that Alex said it's a more plausible argument once you've established God? If you believe in God, then of course the fact that Jesus rose from the dead has a very different probability attached to it. And if Jesus himself is God, then the probability attached to him rising from the dead rises to 1, okay? Therefore, the whole thing is about who is this guy Jesus. And you will always find an escape route from the conclusion that Jesus is the Son of God and rose from the dead. You will always find an escape route if you think that he is just one more man perishing on a Roman cross. If he's one more man perishing on a Roman cross, then of course he rotted in that Jerusalem tomb. Of course. But if he's God, then of course he didn't. And therefore, like, all the plausibility structures for this whole argument rely on the prior probability that you attach to Jesus rising from the dead, which is all about, is he God or not? And therefore, really, I mean, it's an interesting set of facts that you can lay before people, but what's being obscured the whole time is the identity of the person in that tomb. And what we really need to establish is the identity of the person in that tomb. And therefore, I put it to you that a more fruitful way of discussing Jesus and his historicity and his resurrection from the dead is to open up the Gospels and have a look at Jesus himself and ask yourself, is he just one more man? And if he is one more man, then death is the final enemy, and death has never lost a battle. And of course he succumbed to death. Death is bigger than all of us. But if you can read through the Gospels, you can start to see, oh my goodness, I know that death has won every other battle, but I think it's met its match in him. I think that death is not Lord, because death has found its conqueror in Jesus. Jesus is Lord. That's what it means to say that Jesus is Lord. Jesus is bigger than the greatest dominating force in this world. And of course, death is the greatest dominating force in this world. It has swallowed both people and armies and empires. It has swallowed us all. It is Lord unless something else conquers it. And a Christian is someone who looks at the person of Jesus and just says to themselves, look, I know how great death is. I know how powerful death is, but I think it's met its match in Jesus. I think he is Lord. And if he is Lord, then the extraordinary thing would be if he lost to death. The extraordinary thing would be if he rotted in that Jerusalem tomb. And that then completely changes the prior probabilities of a man rising on Easter Sunday. And then, of course, group hallucination becomes the silly option, or the disciples hiding the body and lying about it. But it's all about the question of who is Jesus. And so I just encourage you, if you're a Christian having arguments about like who is Jesus and trying to convince people about who is Jesus, I wouldn't throw a lot of weight onto the minimal historical facts argument. I'd throw all your weight onto the question of just who do you think this Jesus is? Because if he is Lord, then of course he rose from the dead. If he is Lord, and if he is encountering your friend in living power as they read through the scriptures, then of course he didn't die, because he's alive and he's confronting your friend with living power. I think that's the way to think about the resurrection rather than the minimal historical facts argument. That's what I think. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. Perhaps you've had great experience with this argument. Perhaps the minimal historical facts argument is why you're a Christian today. Love to hear that story. If that's you, let me know in the comments. And if you want to check out Jesus for yourself, we'd love you to do 321course.com. It's a Christianity 101 that assumes no prior knowledge. You can do it now. And look, if you're a Christian and you love to share your faith with others, why don't you do the course and you'll see what a great resource it is. And then you can pass it on to your friends. It's as easy as texting them 321course.com, and then your friends can be doing it and you can be doing it, and you can have great conversations about how Jesus really did rise from the dead. That'll do us for now. Why don't you give us a like and a subscribe, and why don't you think about who you can share this video with? We'd love you to share the joy. See you on the next one.